The people most easily dismissed are often the ones carrying someone else's legacy. The crystal chandeliers of the Harrington Grand Ballroom shimmered like frozen stars above hundreds of wealthy guests dressed in black tuxedos and diamond-studded gowns, their laughter blending with the soft piano melody drifting through the air like expensive perfume. Waiters moved carefully between tables carrying silver trays filled with champagne flutes worth more than a month of rent in most parts of Manhattan. Outside, cold November rain tapped quietly against the massive glass windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and silver. Claire Donovan adjusted the cuff of her white serving jacket and steadied the tray trembling slightly in her hands. 12 hours into her shift, her feet ached inside worn black heels, but her expression remained calm, quiet, professional. She had learned years ago that dignity mattered most when nobody else offered you any. Table 14 needs another bottle of Dom Perignon, whispered another waitress rushing past her. Claire nodded softly and reached for the chilled bottle beside the marble counter. Around her, the ballroom pulsed with wealth and power. Politicians, CEOs, investors, old money families whose last names hung on hospitals and university buildings. Tonight was the annual Harrington Foundation Gala, the kind of event where one conversation could change careers overnight. But Claire wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about getting through the evening without attracting attention. That had always been safer. She moved carefully through the ballroom, her honey blonde hair tied neatly into a low bun, her pale blue eyes lowered as guests barely noticed her existence. To them, she was part of the background. Another uniform. Another invisible woman carrying drinks between million-dollar conversations. And Claire preferred it that way, at least until the moment everything went wrong. A man near the center table stepped backward without looking, his polished leather shoe catching the edge of Claire's heel. Time seemed to slow. The silver tray tilted violently in her hands. Crystal glasses slid across the surface. Then came the sound. Sharp, explosive. Champagne flutes shattered against the marble floor, golden liquid splashing across expensive shoes and silk gowns as the piano music abruptly stopped. The entire ballroom turned toward the noise. Silence spread across the room like a cold wind. Claire froze. Her breathing slowed. Tiny pieces of broken crystal glittered beneath the chandelier light around her feet. "Oh my God," someone whispered nearby. A few guests exchanged annoyed looks. Others smirked behind raised glasses. Claire immediately crouched down. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, already reaching for the broken shards with bare hands before anyone else had to step near them. "This is exactly why some people don't belong in rooms like this." The voice cut through the silence like a blade wrapped in velvet. Claire looked up slowly. Victoria Harrington stood near the center staircase wearing an ivory designer gown draped perfectly over her tall frame, diamonds glowing against her pale skin. Everything about her radiated effortless privilege, the kind inherited over generations. Her lips curved into a thin smile as she looked down at Claire still kneeling on the floor. "Honestly," Victoria continued calmly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "the standards at these events fall lower every year." A few uncomfortable laughs spread through the crowd. Claire lowered her eyes again. Her fingers tightened around a broken piece of glass. She said nothing. That only seemed to irritate Victoria more. "Look at the mess you made," she said. "Do you have any idea how much these gowns cost?" Claire inhaled quietly. "I apologize, ma'am." Apologies don't remove stains. Another guest lifted a phone slightly, pretending not to record while several others watched with the quiet fascination people often reserved for public embarrassment. Claire could feel the weight of their eyes pressing against her skin. Heat climbed into her cheeks, but her voice never shook. She simply kept gathering the broken glass one piece at a time. Then Victoria stepped closer. "Maybe next time," she said coldly. "Use the staff entrance like the rest of the service workers instead of wandering through the front pretending you belong here." The words landed harder than a shattered crystal. Not because they were cruel, because Claire had heard versions of them her entire life. "You don't belong here. Too quiet. Too ordinary. Too poor. Too invisible." For a moment, nobody moved. The ballroom remained wrapped in suffocating silence. Even the piano player had stopped touching the keys. Claire lowered her head further and reached for another sharp fragment beside her shoe. A tiny drop of blood appeared against her fingertip where the crystal sliced her skin. She barely noticed. Then suddenly, a deep male voice echoed from the top of the staircase. Calm, controlled, powerful enough to silence the room instantly. Don't touch her. Every head turned upward at once. William Harrington stood beneath the grand staircase arch, one hand resting lightly against the polished railing. At 62, the chairman of Harrington Global carried the kind of presence money alone could never buy. Silver streaks cut through his dark hair. His tailored black tuxedo fit perfectly against his broad frame. But it was his eyes that stopped the room cold. Sharp gray eyes fixed directly on Claire. Not the broken glasses. Not the crowd. Her. Victoria blinked in confusion. William, she said carefully, forcing a laugh. It's just a waitress who spilled champagne. I know exactly who she is. His voice remained low, but dangerous. Claire slowly rose to her feet, still holding the blood-stained napkin in one hand. For several long seconds, William Harrington said nothing at all. He simply stared at her face as if seeing a ghost nobody else in the ballroom could understand. Then his eyes lowered, toward the old silver watch resting against Claire's wrist beneath her uniform sleeve, and the color drained from his face. The entire ballroom held its breath. William descended the staircase one slow step at a time without looking away from her. When he finally reached the marble floor, the chairman of one of the most powerful companies in America stopped directly in front of the trembling waitress everyone else had mocked only seconds earlier. And in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, Claire, where did you get that watch? The ballroom remained completely silent after William Harrington's question. Even the soft clinking of silverware had disappeared beneath the weight of the moment. Claire stood motionless beside the shattered champagne glasses, her fingers tightening instinctively around the blood-stained napkin in her hand. The old silver watch rested quietly against her pale wrist beneath the ballroom lights, suddenly more important than anything else in the room. Victoria Harrington forced an uneasy smile. William, surely this is not the time for, I asked her a question. His voice never rose. It did not need to. Men who spent decades commanding boardrooms learned how to silence people without effort. Victoria immediately looked away. Claire swallowed carefully before speaking. It belonged to my mother. William's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not shock. Something deeper. Something heavier. His gray eyes remained fixed on the watch as if 30 years had collapsed into a single breath. What was her name? He asked quietly. Claire hesitated. Around her, wealthy strangers stared openly now, no longer amused. Curious instead. The room had changed sides without warning. Eleanor Donovan, Claire answered softly. The chairman closed his eyes for half a second. Just half a second. But it was enough. Enough for Claire to notice the pain crossing his face before he hid it again behind decades of practiced control. Somewhere near the orchestra stage, someone whispered William Harrington's late secretary's name under their breath. Another guest frowned in confusion. Victoria's posture stiffened beside the staircase. William finally looked up from the watch to Claire's face. Really looked at her. The same pale blue eyes. The same quiet composure. Even the way she stood under pressure reminded him of another rainy night long ago in a much smaller office filled with fear and newspaper headlines threatening to destroy everything he had spent his life building. How old are you? He asked. 26. Again, silence. William nodded slowly to himself as though confirming a memory only he understood. Claire could feel every person in the ballroom watching her now. Minutes ago, she had been invisible. Now she felt exposed beneath 1,000 silent questions. She lowered her gaze slightly. I should clean this up, she murmured carefully, glancing toward the broken crystals still scattered across the marble floor. Leave it. William's answer came instantly. One of the hotel managers hurried forward at once with staff members and towels, suddenly desperate to prove competence in front of the chairman. Claire stepped back quietly to give them space, but William did not move away from her. Neither did his eyes. Victoria descended 2 steps from the staircase, her diamonds catching the light sharply. William, she said in a lower voice now, the investors are waiting for your speech. They can wait. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. William Harrington was famous for precision, for schedules, for never delaying important business meetings. Yet tonight, the most powerful man in the room seemed completely uninterested in the billion-dollar donors gathered around him. His attention remained entirely on a waitress standing beside spilled champagne. Claire shifted uncomfortably beneath the weight of it all. "Sir," she said gently, "I think there has been some misunderstanding." William studied her for another long moment before asking the question that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "Your mother never told you about me?" Claire blinked. No, his jaw tightened faintly. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall ballroom windows behind them. The piano player remained frozen beside the instrument, unsure whether to continue. "She never mentioned Harrington Global?" William asked. Claire shook her head once. "My mother did not talk much about the past." Something about that answer seemed to wound him quietly. William looked away for the first time, his eyes drifting toward the rain beyond Manhattan's glowing skyline. "That sounds like Eleanor," he said almost to himself. Claire had not heard her mother's name spoken out loud in nearly 3 years. Not since the funeral. Hearing it now inside a ballroom filled with strangers felt strangely unreal. "She passed away last winter," Claire said softly. William went still. Completely still. The kind of stillness that only comes with real grief. Victoria noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. "I did not know," he said at last, his voice lower than before. Claire nodded gently. "It was cancer." Nobody spoke after that. The enormous ballroom suddenly felt smaller somehow. Quieter. Human. William glanced again toward the silver watch. Claire unconsciously covered it with her sleeve. "My mother wore it every day," she explained. "Before she died, she told me never to sell it no matter how difficult life became." William stared at the watch with an expression Claire could not fully understand. Regret perhaps. Or guilt. "She was right," he said quietly. Across the room, several investors were beginning to whisper impatiently. Camera flashes from charity photographers occasionally lit the ballroom walls, but nobody dared interrupt the chairman. Victoria folded her arms carefully. "William," she said with forced calm, "perhaps this conversation would be better handled privately." He finally turned toward her. "Perhaps," he replied evenly. "But since this humiliation happened publicly, I believe certain things should also be corrected publicly." Victoria's face lost color almost immediately. Claire looked between them in confusion. She did not understand what was happening anymore. One moment she had been another exhausted waitress trying to survive a double shift. Now the chairman of Harrington Global was looking at her like someone connected to a chapter of his life he had spent years trying to bury. William reached slowly into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket. The ballroom watched in complete silence as he pulled out an old photograph, worn carefully at the edges from years of being carried. He looked at it briefly before handing it toward Claire. Her breath caught the second she saw the image. A younger William Harrington stood beside a smiling blonde woman wearing the exact same silver watch. Eleanor Donovan. Her mother. Claire looked up slowly, unable to speak. William's eyes softened for the first time all evening. "Your mother saved my life," he said quietly, "and I think it is time you finally learned why." Claire stared down at the old photograph in her trembling hands while the ballroom around her faded into distant silence. Her mother looked younger in the picture than Claire had ever known her. Happier too. Eleanor Donovan stood beside William Harrington on the front steps of a building Claire did not recognize, her blonde hair moving softly in the wind, while William smiled at her with a warmth that seemed impossible compared to the cold businessman standing before her now. The silver watch gleamed on Eleanor's wrist beneath the sunlight exactly as it did tonight beneath the chandeliers. Claire slowly lifted her eyes. "My mother never showed me this." William nodded faintly. "I suspected she would not." His voice carried the quiet exhaustion of someone revisiting memories he had locked away for decades. Around them, the gala guests remained frozen in curiosity. Nobody cared about the fundraiser anymore. Billion-dollar conversations had disappeared beneath the gravity of a single waitress holding an old photograph. Victoria descended the staircase completely now, her expression sharpened by discomfort. She could no longer hide behind polished smiles. "William," she said carefully, "the press is here tonight." "I am aware." "Then perhaps this is not the appropriate setting for personal stories." William finally looked toward the crowd surrounding them. Camera flashes reflected against crystal glasses. Investors whispered behind raised champagne flutes. Socialites leaned subtly closer, desperate to hear every word. He had spent 30 years protecting his image from rooms exactly like this one. Yet tonight, He seemed strangely tired of protecting anything at all. There was a time, William said calmly, his eyes returning to Claire, when every newspaper in New York believed I was finished. Claire listened quietly while clutching the photograph carefully against her chest. I was 32, he continued. Harrington Global was still small then. We were negotiating our first international merger. Everything depended on that deal. The ballroom remained silent enough to hear rain sliding against the windows high above Manhattan. Someone inside the company leaked false financial records to the press, Williams said. Within 48 hours, investors began pulling out. Banks stopped returning my calls. The board wanted me removed. Claire noticed the faint tightening in his jaw as he spoke. Not anger. Memory. My mother worked for you, she asked softly. William nodded once. Eleanor was my executive assistant. Several guests exchanged surprised glances immediately. An assistant, not a socialite, not old money, just an ordinary employee. Yet William Harrington spoke about her with the kind of respect powerful men rarely offered anyone. She was the only person who stayed, he said quietly. Everyone else protected themselves. Eleanor protected me. Claire lowered her gaze toward the photograph again. She could barely connect the gentle woman who packed her school lunches with the person William described. Her mother had never spoken about corporate scandals or billion-dollar deals. She spent her life avoiding attention, not standing at the center of it. The leaked records were fake, William continued. But nobody could prove it. Until your mother walked into my office during a thunderstorm carrying evidence she had spent 3 nights uncovering alone. His eyes drifted briefly toward the rain outside again. She exposed the entire scheme herself. Claire felt something tighten painfully in her chest. What happened after that? William gave a faint smile without humor. The company survived. The board apologized. The newspapers moved on to another scandal. And my mother? For the first time all evening, genuine regret crossed William's face openly. She resigned 2 weeks later. Claire frowned softly. Why? William looked down at the marble floor for several seconds before answering. Because people began talking. Victoria crossed her arms. William, no, his voice stopped her immediately. She deserves the truth. He looked back toward Claire. People assumed Eleanor and I were involved romantically because she defended me so publicly. Gossip spreads quickly among wealthy people, especially when they need a woman to blame for a powerful man surviving scandal. Claire's fingers tightened around the photograph edges. That sounded painfully familiar. My mother left because of rumors? Because of cruelty, William corrected quietly. And because I failed to stop it. The words landed heavily between them. Claire suddenly remembered nights when her mother came home exhausted from jobs she never kept for long. Small apartments. Unpaid bills hidden inside kitchen drawers. The way Eleanor always changed the subject whenever Claire asked about her past. She never hated you, Claire said softly before realizing the words had slipped out naturally. William's eyes lifted toward her immediately. How do you know? Claire swallowed carefully. Because she kept the watch. Silence again. A softer silence this time. One carrying grief instead of judgment. William stared at the silver watch with visible emotion in his eyes now. I gave her that watch the day the company survived, he admitted quietly. I told her someday I would repay the debt I owed her. He looked slowly around the ballroom filled with wealth, cameras, and polished smiles. But Eleanor disappeared before I had the chance. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice. William, enough. Enough. He turned toward her fully for the first time. This young woman was humiliated in front of hundreds of people tonight because nobody here thought she mattered. His gray eyes swept across the silent guests. Including you. Nobody dared answer him. Victoria's face tightened beneath the ballroom lights. She is staff, Victoria replied carefully. I treated her according to protocol. William's expression hardened instantly. No, you treated her according to status. The sentence hit the room harder than shouting ever could. Claire felt dozens of eyes shift uncomfortably away from her. William slowly extended his hand toward her then. Not as a chairman, not as a billionaire, simply as a man carrying old regret. Claire, he said gently, would you walk with me for a moment? She hesitated. Every instinct told her to refuse. To return to the kitchen. To disappear before this night changed her life in ways she could not control. But something in William's eyes reminded her painfully of her mother during quiet evenings by their apartment window. Tired, lonely, carrying too much silence for too many years. Claire placed the photograph carefully against her chest and nodded once. Then together, beneath the stunned gaze of Manhattan's elite, the chairman of Harrington Global walked beside the waitress everyone had mocked only minutes earlier and led her away from the center of the ballroom, while whispers followed them like shadows across the marble floor. The whispers followed Claire across the ballroom like cold wind moving through silk curtains. Every guest watched her walk beside William Harrington with the same stunned disbelief people reserved for impossible things. A waitress did not leave a gala beside the chairman of Harrington Global, not unless something extraordinary had happened. Claire kept her hands folded carefully in front of her apron as they moved through the enormous room together. She could still feel traces of champagne drying against her sleeves. Her fingertips still stung faintly from the broken crystal. But none of that compared to the strange pressure building quietly in her chest. William guided her away from the crowded ballroom toward a smaller hallway lined with black and white photographs from decades of Harrington Foundation events. The noise behind them faded gradually. Laughter became muffled. Music softened. By the time they reached the private lounge near the East Terrace, the gala felt 1,000 miles away. William opened the door himself. The room inside was warm and dimly lit with amber lamps and dark oak walls. Rain rolled softly against the tall windows overlooking Manhattan below. A fireplace crackled quietly near two leather chairs positioned beside a small table set with untouched coffee cups. Claire hesitated near the doorway. "I should probably return to work," she said gently. William closed the door behind them. "Tonight, you are the last person in this building who should be serving anyone." Claire lowered her eyes slightly. She was not used to kindness from powerful men, especially not men like him. William removed his tuxedo jacket slowly and placed it over the back of one chair before loosening his tie for the first time all evening. The movement made him look older somehow, less like a chairman, more like a tired man carrying memories he no longer knew how to hold alone. "Please sit," he said quietly. Claire carefully lowered herself into the chair nearest the window while keeping the photograph and silver watch close against her chest. William remained standing for a moment beside the fireplace, staring into the flames before speaking again. "Your mother used to do that." Claire looked up. "Do what?" "Hold objects close when she felt nervous." A faint smile touched his face briefly. "Usually folders. Sometimes coffee cups." Claire looked down at her hands instinctively. "I did not know that." William nodded slowly. "There are probably many things you do not know." Silence settled softly between them. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. Rain streaked down the windows while distant city lights blurred beneath the storm outside. Claire finally spoke first. "Why did my mother never tell me any of this?" William exhaled quietly before answering. "Because Eleanor spent most of her life protecting people she loved from difficult truths." Claire swallowed carefully. That sounded exactly like her mother. Even during chemotherapy, Eleanor Donovan smiled gently whenever Claire asked if she was in pain. She always carried suffering quietly, as if silence itself were a form of dignity. William moved toward a wooden cabinet near the fireplace and removed a dark bottle of sparkling water before pouring 2 glasses slowly. "After Eleanor left Harrington Global," he said, "I searched for her." Claire looked up immediately. "You did?" "For years." He handed her a glass gently before taking the seat across from her. But she disappeared completely. New apartment, new phone number, new life. Claire frowned softly. That does not sound like her. William's gray eyes softened with something close to sadness. It became like her after the scandal. Claire stared quietly at the rain outside. Her mother never spoke about fear directly, but Claire remembered small things now. The way Eleanor avoided crowded events. The way she changed routes walking home. The way she once froze after seeing her own name mentioned briefly in an old newspaper article at a grocery store checkout line. Did the rumors hurt her that badly? Claire asked softly. William leaned back slowly in his chair. People think gossip disappears after headlines fade. It does not. It follows women much longer than men. Claire said nothing because deep down she already knew he was right. Board members' wives stopped inviting her to events. William continued quietly. People assumed she used me for influence. Some employees treated her differently. Others treated her cruelly. His jaw tightened faintly. And I let it happen because I thought protecting the company mattered more than protecting one person. The fire crackled softly between them. Claire looked down at the silver watch resting against her wrist. She never blamed you, she whispered. William closed his eyes briefly. That somehow makes it worse. Outside the lounge doors, distant ballroom music slowly resumed. The gala was continuing without them now. Speeches, donations, polished smiles. But inside this small room, time seemed suspended somewhere between regret and memory. Claire carefully placed the photograph on the table between them. When my mother got sick, she said quietly, she still worked 2 jobs. William's expression changed instantly. 2 jobs, Claire nodded. A bookstore during the day, a diner at night. The chairman lowered his gaze slowly. Claire continued softly. I used to ask her why she worked so hard when she was already exhausted. Her fingers tightened around the water glass. She always said she needed to leave me something valuable before she was gone. William looked toward the silver watch again. The watch. Claire shook her head gently. Not the watch. Her voice softened almost to a whisper. She said dignity was the only thing nobody could take from you unless you handed it away yourself. The room fell silent again. William stared at her for several long seconds before looking away toward the fire. Claire suddenly noticed moisture gathering faintly in the corners of his eyes, though he blinked it away almost immediately. Powerful men often learned how to hide grief. But not perfectly. That sounds exactly like Eleanor, he murmured. A soft knock interrupted the room suddenly. William straightened immediately. Come in. The door opened carefully. A young assistant stepped inside, looking visibly nervous. Sir, he said quietly. The board members are requesting you return to the ballroom for the investor presentation. William's face hardened slightly at the interruption. Tell them they can begin without me. The assistant blinked in confusion. Sir, without me? William repeated calmly. The assistant nodded quickly and disappeared again. Claire stared at him in disbelief after the door closed. You are skipping your own presentation? William gave a faint, tired smile. Claire, tonight I discovered the daughter of the woman who saved my life standing barefoot in broken glass while people laughed at her. His gray eyes met hers steadily. Trust me, nothing happening in that ballroom is more important than this conversation. Claire sat quietly beside the rain-covered window while the warmth from the fireplace softened the cold still lingering in her hands. For the first time all evening, the noise inside her mind began to slow. The ballroom humiliation already felt distant now, almost unreal compared to the strange calm filling the private lounge. William Harrington remained seated across from her, one hand resting against the arm of the leather chair, while the untouched glass of sparkling water reflected the firelight beside him. Outside the windows, Manhattan shimmered beneath the storm like another world entirely. Claire looked down again at the photograph on the table between them. Her mother's smile seemed softer the longer she stared at it. I have never seen her look like that before, Claire admitted quietly. William followed her gaze. That picture was taken the day Harrington Global survived the merger. A faint smile touched his face. Eleanor hated cameras. She only agreed because I insisted. Claire traced the edge of the photograph carefully with her fingertip. She stopped smiling in pictures after I was born. William's expression dimmed slightly at the words. I am sorry. Claire shook her head gently. Do not apologize for things you did not cause. William looked at her steadily for several seconds before speaking. That is exactly what your mother used to say whenever I apologized too much. Claire could not help the small, surprised smile that appeared briefly on her face. William noticed it immediately, not because it was dramatic, because it looked so much like Eleanor's smile that it almost stole the air from the room. He turned his eyes toward the fireplace again. Your mother had a habit of making difficult moments feel smaller, he murmured, even when she was the one carrying the most weight. Claire's chest tightened softly. She remembered nights sitting at the kitchen counter while Eleanor graded bookstore inventory sheets beneath weak apartment lighting. Remembered hearing quiet coughing through thin bedroom walls long before the doctors finally discovered the cancer. Her mother always made exhaustion look temporary, as if strength were simply another form of silence. Why did you keep searching for her? Claire asked after a moment. William remained still. Because I owed her more than gratitude. Claire looked up slowly. What does that mean? The chairman exhaled quietly before answering. After the scandal ended, I asked Eleanor to stay. His voice lowered slightly with memory. Not as an assistant. As a partner in the company. Claire blinked in surprise. My mother worked in corporate finance. No. William said with the faintest trace of admiration in his eyes. She simply understood people better than anyone I had ever met. Rain tapped softly against the windows again. Eleanor could walk into a room and know immediately who was lying, who was afraid, and who needed kindness more than criticism. He gave a small, tired smile. Most executives spend their entire careers trying to learn what she understood naturally. Claire stared quietly at the photograph again. That sounded exactly like the woman who spent years leaving grocery money anonymously for struggling neighbors inside their apartment building. She turned me down, William said suddenly. Claire looked up. What? The partnership. His eyes softened with old disappointment. She told me powerful men often mistake gratitude for ownership. Claire felt a faint ache behind her ribs hearing that sentence. It sounded painfully familiar too. Did you love her? The question slipped out before she could stop herself. Silence immediately filled the room again. The fire cracked softly between them while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline. William did not answer right away. Instead, he stared into the flames with the expression of someone standing beside memories too fragile to touch directly. Yes, he admitted quietly at last, but not in the way people assumed. Claire listened carefully. I admired her, he continued. Trusted her. Needed her honesty more than I realized at the time. His jaw tightened faintly. And I think Eleanor understood me better than I understood myself. Claire lowered her eyes slowly. Did she love you? William gave a sad smile. Your mother loved quietly. She rarely said things directly. He looked toward the silver watch resting against Claire's wrist. But she stayed beside me when everyone else walked away. Claire's throat tightened unexpectedly. She remembered her mother doing the exact same thing throughout life. Staying beside people long after they deserved it. Caring for neighbors. Helping strangers. Forgiving too easily. The room suddenly felt heavy with the presence of someone no longer alive. A silence shaped exactly like Eleanor Donovan. Then another soft knock interrupted the moment. This time the door opened before William answered. Victoria stepped inside wearing the same immaculate ivory gown, though her expression now carried visible strain beneath its polished surface. Her eyes immediately landed on Claire seated beside the fireplace. The board members are becoming concerned, she said carefully. The media is asking questions. William remained seated. Let them ask. Victoria's composure tightened slightly. William, you cannot disappear from your own gala for nearly an hour because of a waitress. The room went still instantly. Claire lowered her gaze toward the photograph again. William's face hardened in a way Claire had not yet seen tonight. Cold. Controlled. Dangerous. Her name, he said quietly, is Claire Donovan. Victoria crossed her arms. I understand emotions are involved, but this situation is becoming public. Good. Victoria blinked. Excuse me. William slowly stood from his chair. Even at 62, he carried authority with effortless weight. For 30 years, he said calmly, people like us benefited from Eleanor Donovan's silence. His gray eyes met Victoria's steadily. Tonight, I am no longer interested in silence. Victoria glanced uneasily toward Claire. What exactly are you planning to do? William reached for the photograph resting on the table. He studied Eleanor's smiling face for one long second before answering. Something I should have done decades ago. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken softly as William turned toward her again. The firelight reflected against his silver hair while rain continued falling beyond the windows. Claire, he said gently, would you come back into the ballroom with me? She hesitated instantly. Why? William's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. Because nobody in that room is ever going to look down on Eleanor Donovan's daughter again. Claire followed William Harrington through the quiet hallway with slow, uncertain steps, while the silver watch rested heavily against her wrist beneath the sleeve of her uniform. Her heart had not stopped racing since the moment he asked her to return to the ballroom beside him. Every instinct inside her still wanted to disappear quietly through the service exit and leave this entire night behind. That was what her mother would have done. Avoid attention. Avoid conflict. Survive quietly. But something in William's voice had made refusal impossible. The closer they moved toward the ballroom doors, the louder the distant music became again. Piano melodies. Crystal glasses. The familiar sound of wealthy people pretending life was simple beneath expensive lighting. William walked beside her calmly with one hand resting near his pocket, his expression unreadable now. Chairman again. controlled again. But Claire noticed the subtle tension in his jaw. He was preparing for something. "You do not have to do this," she said softly as they stopped near the entrance doors. William turned toward her. "Yes," he answered quietly. "I do." Claire lowered her eyes briefly. "I am not trying to cause trouble for anyone." A faint sadness crossed his face. "That sentence alone proves you are Eleanor's daughter." Before Claire could respond, the ballroom doors opened. Sound rushed toward them instantly. Conversations slowed one by one as guests noticed William returning. Then silence spread across the room again the moment people realized Claire stood beside him. The same waitress. The same stained uniform. The same woman many of them had watched being humiliated less than an hour earlier. Only now, she walked beside the chairman himself. The orchestra stopped playing almost immediately. Hundreds of eyes followed them across the marble floor, while rain shimmered faintly against the towering windows surrounding the ballroom. Claire could feel the pressure of every stare pressing against her skin again. But this time something was different. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered loudly enough to be heard. Fear had replaced amusement. William guided Claire toward the center stage where the Harrington Foundation logo glowed behind a polished podium surrounded by white roses and gold lighting. Several board members stood nearby, looking deeply uncomfortable. Victoria remained near the staircase, holding a champagne glass she no longer seemed interested in drinking. William stepped behind the podium slowly. Claire remained beside the stage, uncertain where to stand in a room suddenly revolving entirely around her existence. William adjusted the microphone once. The sound echoed softly across the silent ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began calmly, "I had originally planned to spend tonight discussing charitable investments and international expansion." A few nervous laughs appeared, but disappeared quickly beneath his expression. But sometimes life interrupts polished plans with necessary truth. Claire lowered her eyes slightly. William continued. 30 years ago, Harrington Global nearly collapsed during a financial scandal that many of you are old enough to remember. Several older guests exchanged glances immediately. Most people abandoned the company. Some protected their reputations. Others protected their money. His voice remained steady. "One person protected me." William slowly turned toward Claire, standing quietly beside the stage. Her name was Eleanor Donovan. Complete silence filled the ballroom again. "Eleanor worked for Harrington Global during its earliest years," William said. "And when false accusations threatened to destroy everything we had built, she uncovered the truth herself." Claire noticed genuine surprise crossing several guests' faces now. Most of them had never heard her mother's name before tonight. William looked slowly across the room, filled with executives and investors. The success many people celebrate today exists because a young woman with no wealth, no influence, and no protection chose integrity over fear. His words settled heavily across the ballroom. But instead of rewarding her courage properly, this city rewarded her with gossip. Victoria shifted uncomfortably near the staircase. William's voice sharpened slightly. People questioned her character, her motives, her dignity. He paused briefly, and I allowed that silence to continue for far too long. Claire's chest tightened softly, hearing the pain beneath his controlled tone. William stepped away from the podium then, not toward the investors, toward Claire. The movement alone stunned the room. He stopped directly beside her before speaking again. "Tonight, many of you watched this young woman be treated as insignificant because she wore a waitress uniform instead of diamonds. No one moved. Some of you laughed. The silence grew unbearable now. William's gray eyes swept slowly through the crowd. What none of you understood is that Claire Donovan carries more grace, strength, and dignity than most people in this room combined." Claire felt heat rush into her face immediately. She wanted to disappear again. But William continued before she could lower her head. "Her mother once protected my future while the world looked down on her." His voice softened carefully. "Tonight, I will not make the same mistake twice." Then, beneath the stunned gaze of Manhattan's elite, William Harrington extended his hand toward Claire publicly. Not as charity, not as pity, as respect. Claire stared at his hand for one trembling second before placing hers carefully into it. William turned back toward the crowd. "Claire Donovan is not someone to be dismissed." His voice remained calm but absolute. "She is family to this company. Family to me." The words seemed to physically change the atmosphere inside the ballroom. Several guests immediately lowered their eyes in visible shame. Others looked toward Claire with sudden, desperate politeness. The same people who ignored her existence earlier now looked terrified of offending her. Victoria stood frozen beside the staircase, her face pale beneath the chandelier lights. Claire noticed something then that her mother once taught her quietly during difficult years. Power changes how people look at you, but character changes whether you let it change you. William released her hand gently before speaking one final time into the stunned silence. True class, he said quietly, has never depended on invitations, wealth, or last names. His eyes drifted toward Claire again. Sometimes it survives quietly inside the people the world refuses to notice. Nobody applauded at first. The room seemed too overwhelmed for sound. Then slowly, one older board member near the front began clapping softly. Another joined him. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted into applause so loud it echoed against the crystal chandeliers overhead. But Claire barely heard any of it, because for the first time in years, she could almost feel her mother standing beside her again. The applause continued rolling through the ballroom like distant thunder beneath the crystal chandeliers, but Claire barely knew what to do with her hands anymore. She stood beside William Harrington in her stained waitress uniform, while Manhattan's most powerful people looked at her with entirely different eyes than they had less than an hour earlier. Some smiled nervously now. Others avoided eye contact completely. A few guests who had laughed earlier suddenly seemed fascinated by their champagne glasses instead. Claire felt strangely detached from all of it, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold from far away. William rested one steady hand lightly against the middle of her back and guided her away from the center stage while the applause slowly softened into quiet conversation again. But this time the whispers sounded different. Respectful, careful, almost fearful. Claire noticed servers from the hotel kitchen staring at her openly as she passed. One young waitress near the dining tables gave her a small emotional smile before quickly looking away again. Claire understood that smile instantly. Every service worker in the room had just watched someone like them become impossible to ignore. Breathe, William murmured quietly beside her. Claire looked up in surprise. I am breathing. A faint, tired smile touched his face. No, you are surviving. The sentence hit deeper than she expected. Because it was true. She had spent most of her life surviving quietly. Rent payments, hospital bills, double shifts, long subway rides home after midnight. Keeping her head down in rooms where wealth automatically decided whose voice mattered. William guided her toward a quieter section near the tall ballroom windows where city lights shimmered through the rain. The orchestra slowly resumed playing soft piano music in the background, though the atmosphere of the gala had changed completely now. Nobody could return to pretending tonight had been ordinary. Claire. She turned slightly at the sound of her name. An older woman wearing an emerald gown approached hesitantly, while holding a champagne flute in both hands. Claire recognized her vaguely from magazines beside grocery store checkout counters. Senator Margaret Holloway. I knew your mother, the senator said softly. Genuine emotion filled her eyes. Eleanor helped me once when nobody else in this city would return my calls. Claire blinked in surprise. You knew her? Margaret nodded gently. Your mother had a way of making people feel seen when the world wanted them invisible. The senator smiled sadly. She never asked for anything in return. Claire felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Another stranger carrying memories of her mother she had never heard before. Margaret touched Claire's arm softly before walking away again into the crowd. More people slowly began approaching after that. A retired board member, an elderly investor, even one of the hotel executives. Each carried small stories about Eleanor Donovan. Quiet kindnesses, honest advice. Moments of unexpected grace that had stayed with them for decades. Claire listened silently while piecing together a version of her mother far larger than the tired woman who came home exhausted every night to their small apartment. Eleanor Donovan had mattered deeply to people. She had simply never spoken about it. William watched Claire carefully through all of it. He recognized the expression slowly forming in her eyes. The painful realization that someone you loved had been carrying entire worlds inside themselves without ever complaining. Then Victoria approached again, this time alone. The room subtly quieted around her immediately. Claire straightened slightly without meaning to. Victoria stopped a few feet away, her ivory gown glowing beneath the chandelier light, while discomfort flickered visibly behind her polished expression. For several seconds, she said nothing. She simply looked at Claire carefully, not with cruelty now, with uncertainty. "Miss Donovan," she said finally, her voice quieter than before, "I owe you an apology." Nearby conversations softened further as guests pretended not to listen. Claire remained still. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly before continuing. "I judged you unfairly tonight." Her fingers tightened subtly around the stem of her champagne glass. "And I spoke to you disrespectfully." Claire noticed how difficult the words seemed for her to say. William remained silent beside them, allowing the moment to belong entirely to Claire. The entire ballroom felt suspended around the answer she chose next. Claire could have embarrassed Victoria publicly, could have repeated every cruel sentence back to her in front of the same crowd. The power finally belonged to her now. But instead, Claire simply said softly, "Thank you for apologizing." Victoria blinked in visible surprise. "That is all." Claire glanced briefly toward the rain beyond the windows before answering. "My mother taught me that humiliation spreads quickly when people pass it forward." Silence settled gently between them. Victoria's expression shifted slowly into something almost ashamed. Real shame, not social embarrassment. Human shame. "Your mother sounds extraordinary," she admitted quietly. Claire looked down at the silver watch resting against her wrist. "She was tired most of the time?" Claire whispered. "But yes, she was extraordinary." Victoria nodded once before stepping away slowly into the crowd again. William watched Claire carefully after she left. "You could have destroyed her socially just now," he said quietly. Claire gave the faintest shrug. "What would that fix?" For the first time all evening, William laughed softly beneath his breath. Not because anything was funny, because Eleanor Donovan would have answered the exact same way. A waiter approached carefully carrying a fresh tray of champagne. He looked nervous standing near Claire now. "Miss Donovan," he asked quietly, "would you like something to drink?" Claire almost smiled at the sudden change in tone. An hour ago nobody even bothered learning her name. "Water is fine," she said gently. The waiter nodded immediately and hurried away. William studied her quietly beside the ballroom windows while thunder rolled softly outside above Manhattan. "You know," he said after a moment, "most people would be enjoying this attention very differently." Claire frowned slightly. Attention disappears quickly. And dignity. She looked toward the rain again before answering softly. "That depends on whether you trade it for approval." William fell silent beside her. Because once again, Eleanor Donovan's voice somehow lived on through her daughter. Across the ballroom, guests continued stealing glances toward Claire Donovan. But none of them noticed the small detail William Harrington saw most clearly. Despite the applause, despite the public recognition, despite suddenly becoming the most important person in the room, Claire still held herself exactly the same way she had while kneeling beside broken glass earlier that night. Quiet, graceful, unshaken. And in that moment, William finally understood something Eleanor had tried teaching him decades ago. True elegance was never something money could buy. Sometimes it survived quietly inside people who had every reason to become bitter but chose kindness instead. By the time the gala dinner finally began, the atmosphere inside the ballroom had transformed completely. Earlier that evening, the room had carried the cold confidence of old money and polished appearances. Now something quieter lingered beneath the chandelier light. Reflection, unease, respect. Claire sat near the far end of the chairman's private table, wearing the same black and white waitress uniform she had started the evening in. Several hotel staff members had quietly offered to bring her a formal gown after William's public speech, but Claire declined every offer gently. "My mother taught me never to change clothes just because someone important finally noticed me," she had said softly. Word of that sentence had already traveled through half the ballroom. William sat beside her now, occasionally speaking with board members or investors, but his attention drifted toward Claire more often than business. Not because she demanded it, because she never did. Across the room, guests continued watching her carefully between conversations. The same people who once dismissed her now seemed desperate to understand her. But Claire remained calm beneath the attention. She folded her napkin neatly beside her untouched dinner plate and listened more than she spoke. Rain still streaked softly across the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan, while piano music floated quietly through the room. "You are handling this remarkably well," William said in a low voice beside her after another executive awkwardly introduced himself for the second time that evening. Claire gave a faint smile. Handling what? William looked around the ballroom slowly. Becoming the center of a room that ignored you an hour ago. Claire lowered her gaze briefly toward the silver watch resting against her wrist. I spent years watching people become kind only after discovering someone useful. Her voice remained gentle. It stops feeling personal after a while. William studied her carefully. There was no bitterness in the sentence. Only truth. That somehow made it sadder. A waiter approached quietly carrying dinner menus embossed with gold lettering. He placed one in front of Claire carefully, almost nervously, before asking, "Miss Donovan, may I bring you the chef's special tonight?" Claire blinked softly at the sudden formality. "Soup is fine," she answered kindly. The waiter nodded immediately. William noticed something then that most people in the ballroom missed. Every employee who approached Claire left calmer than before. Seen somehow. Respected. It was the exact same effect Eleanor Donovan used to have on people. The chairman leaned back slightly in his chair while memories returned quietly through the sound of rain and piano music. Eleanor sitting beside him during impossible negotiations. Eleanor bringing coffee to exhausted interns nobody else noticed. Eleanor once spending an entire Christmas Eve helping a janitor find his missing wedding ring instead of attending the executive holiday party upstairs. She had never performed kindness loudly. She simply carried it naturally. And somehow, sitting beside Claire now, William realized that same quiet grace had survived another generation. "Claire," he said softly after a moment, "what were your plans before tonight?" She looked up from her water glass. "Plans? Your life." William's expression softened slightly. "What did you want before survival became the priority?" Claire fell silent. Nobody had asked her that question in years. Maybe ever. She stared toward the city lights beyond the rain-covered windows while thinking carefully. "I studied literature for 2 years," she admitted quietly. William looked surprised. "You did?" Claire nodded faintly. "Night classes at Hunter College." "Why did you stop?" A small silence passed before she answered. "Hospital bills." William lowered his eyes slowly. "Your mother's treatments?" Claire nodded once. "Insurance covered some of it. Not enough." Around them, crystal glasses clinked softly while wealthy guests discussed stock markets and vacation homes. The contrast almost hurt. William's voice lowered further. "You left school to take care of her. There was nobody else." Claire's answer came simply, without self-pity. William stared quietly at the white tablecloth between them for several seconds. "Eleanor would hate knowing what you sacrificed." Claire looked toward him gently. "No." Her fingers brushed lightly against the silver watch. "She would hate knowing I regretted it." The chairman exhaled slowly beneath the weight of that answer. Across the ballroom, Victoria remained seated near several donors, though Claire occasionally noticed her glancing toward them with an unreadable expression. Not hostility anymore. Something more complicated. Regret, perhaps. Then suddenly, a young hotel employee approached the table nervously. Claire recognized him immediately as one of the kitchen assistants. Barely 20 years old, usually invisible to guests. "Miss Donovan," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you." Claire blinked in confusion. "For what?" The young man swallowed nervously before answering. "For tonight." His eyes lowered briefly. "Most people here do not look at staff members unless something goes wrong." The sentence settled heavily between them. But after what Mr. Harrington said, he hesitated. "A lot of us feel different right now." Claire's expression softened immediately. "What is your name?" The young employee looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Daniel." Claire smiled faintly. "Thank you, Daniel." The young man nodded quickly before returning toward the kitchen, though his shoulders seemed straighter somehow. William watched the interaction quietly beside her. "You know," he said after Daniel left, "most people in your position tonight would be enjoying revenge." Claire looked almost confused by the idea. Against who? William gave a faint, tired smile. "Exactly." The orchestra shifted into a softer melody, while servers carried candlelit desserts through the ballroom. Beyond the windows, Manhattan glowed beneath silver rain like a city holding too many secrets at once. Claire suddenly reached into the pocket of her apron and carefully unfolded something small and worn. A letter. The paper looked old from years of being opened and folded again. "My mother gave me this 3 days before she died," Claire said quietly. William's expression changed instantly. "What is it?" Claire stared at the folded paper for a moment before answering. She told me not to read it unless I ever met you. The room around them seemed to disappear completely then. William slowly lowered his champagne glass onto the table, while thunder rolled softly above the city outside. Claire looked down at the letter resting carefully in her hands. Her mother's handwriting remained visible across the front in faded blue ink. William Harrington. Personal. For several seconds neither of them moved at all. Then Claire finally whispered, "I think she knew this night would happen someday." The letter felt impossibly light in Claire's hands, and yet somehow heavier than anything she had carried in years. Around them, the gala continued beneath crystal chandeliers and soft piano music, but the world inside the chairman's table had narrowed into silence. William Harrington stared at the faded handwriting on the envelope, as though seeing a ghost return slowly through time. Eleanor Donovan. Even her handwriting looked graceful. Careful. Calm. Claire ran her thumb lightly across the folded edge before speaking. I never opened it. William looked up immediately. Not once. Claire shook her head. My mother made me promise. Rain drifted softly against the ballroom windows while candlelight flickered across polished silverware and untouched desserts. Nearby conversations had lowered respectfully around them. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever this moment had become. Claire carefully placed the letter onto the white tablecloth between them. She said, "If I ever met you," Claire whispered softly, "I would finally understand why some people carry sadness even when they have everything." William closed his eyes briefly. The sentence struck with frightening precision because Eleanor once said almost the exact same thing to him during a winter night decades ago, inside a nearly empty office overlooking Manhattan. He reached toward the letter slowly, but stopped before touching it. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Claire nodded once. "I think she wrote it for both of us." William carefully opened the envelope with trembling fingers that no boardroom or billion-dollar negotiation had ever managed to shake before. The paper inside looked worn with age, but perfectly preserved. Eleanor Donovan's handwriting flowed softly across the page in blue ink. William began reading silently at first. Then his breathing slowed. His shoulders stiffened slightly. Claire watched emotion move quietly across his face like shadows passing over water. Regret, grief, love. By the time he reached the middle of the letter, he removed his glasses slowly and pressed one hand briefly against his mouth. Claire had never seen a powerful man look so unguarded before. William finally lowered the letter slightly. "Would you like me to read it aloud?" Claire's throat tightened softly, but she nodded. William steadied himself before speaking. "Dear William, if you are reading this someday, it means life has once again ignored our carefully made plans." His voice remained calm, though emotion lived quietly beneath every word. "I imagine you are older now, hopefully wiser, probably still working too much." A faint sad smile crossed William's face. Several guests nearby listened silently without pretending not to anymore. "There are things I never said because silence sometimes protects people better than honesty. But silence also leaves important things unfinished." Claire stared at the rain beyond the windows while listening to her mother's voice return through another person's mouth. "You once asked me why I left Harrington Global after the scandal ended. The truth is simple. I knew the world would never allow a woman to stand beside a powerful man without trying to turn her kindness into something ugly." William paused briefly before continuing. "You spent years trying to save your company. I spent years trying to protect your heart from becoming like the people around you." The chairman lowered his eyes for one painful second. "You once told me gratitude and love are not the same thing." I agreed. But I also knew the world had already made up stories about us before either of us understood what we meant to each other. Claire's fingers tightened softly around the silver watch resting on her wrist. "I never regretted helping you. Not for one moment. Some people enter our lives loudly and leave destruction behind them. Others arrive quietly and leave us better than they found us. You were one of those people for me." William's voice almost broke at the final sentence. He paused briefly before reading the last section more softly than before. "If you ever meet my daughter someday, please do not give her money out of guilt or kindness out of obligation. Simply remind her that dignity matters more than status, and that her mother once knew a good man beneath all the noise surrounding him." The ballroom had become completely silent again. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. William stared at the final line for several long seconds before forcing himself to continue. "And William, If life made you lonely after all these years, I hope you finally learned that being admired is not the same thing as being understood. His voice faded quietly into silence. Nobody moved. Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes for the first time all evening, but she blinked them away gently. Her mother had always hated crying in public. William folded the letter carefully with trembling hands before looking toward Claire. She always knew exactly who I was, he whispered. Claire gave a faint emotional smile. She usually knew who everyone was. A soft laugh escaped William unexpectedly through the grief in his chest. Yes, he admitted quietly. She did. Across the ballroom, several guests lowered their eyes emotionally. Even Victoria stood motionless near the staircase with visible tears shining beneath the chandelier light. Nobody in the room seemed untouched anymore. Because for the first time all evening, Eleanor Donovan no longer felt like a story about scandal or status. She felt human, real, the kind of person who quietly changes lives without asking for recognition. William carefully handed the letter back to Claire. Their fingers brushed briefly above the tablecloth. Your mother was the finest person I ever knew, he said softly. Claire looked down at the folded paper in her hands. She would have hated this much attention. William smiled sadly. Probably. Then his expression softened further. But I think she would have been proud of you tonight. Claire lowered her eyes immediately. I did not do anything. William looked around the ballroom slowly. Wealthy strangers, executives, politicians, people obsessed with appearances. Then back toward Claire Donovan, sitting quietly in a stained waitress uniform beside candlelight and rain. No, he said gently. You reminded an entire room what grace actually looks like. Thunder rolled softly beyond Manhattan, while the orchestra slowly resumed a quiet piano melody somewhere near the ballroom stage. Claire folded the letter carefully and slipped it beside the silver watch against her wrist. For the first time since her mother died, the emptiness inside her chest no longer felt quite so cold. And across the room filled with wealth and power, people who once measured human value by status suddenly understood something Eleanor Donovan had known all along. The quietest people often leave the deepest mark on the world.